Hi, everybody. We have, I'm just sort of letting people in as we go. For those of you who are new to the town hall and haven't joined us, I'm Lori. I'm the director of the Beagle Alliance, and Mary, you can see, is the rescue and volunteer director for the Beagle Alliance, as well as the co-founder and executive director of our partner rescue in the States, Cage to Couch. And of course, we have Camille Labchuk here from Animal Justice. And some of you may remember Andrew, who spoke last time about the CCAC, has joined us as well. I know that Chiru, Dr. Chandrasekhara, was away, so I'm not sure if she was unable to join, which is entirely possible. And we were just kind of talking about summer and how we all in Canada realized that we have 2 last weeks of summer. So I was kind of like, I wonder how well attended this is going to be in August, when people are thinking, I don't want to sit at my computer in August on the last 2 weeks. So we're just going to go ahead because I'm hoping everyone will contribute to the discussion. We'll start with Camille about how she got into what she's doing and the passion behind her passion. And I love to hear everybody's stories about, I think everyone sort of has a story about their animal or animals that kind of inspired them to want to do differently in the world. On top of that, I put in the chat before we started, I put, and you'll notice my typo there, but I put some of the links to the Canadian Centre to Alternatives to Animal Methods. I put the Animal Justice link. I put Andrew has a great source of links of interest on his site that is just really thorough and amazing. So I threw that in. And as well, we're really promoting people putting in their feedback on the Canadian Council on Animal Care guidelines, animal ethic guidelines. So I put that link in so you guys can take a look, copy and paste, and take a look at the draft. Anyway, that said, thank you guys all for coming, and thank you, Camille, for coming to chat, and I will leave it to you.
Thank you so much, Lori. And just to note, feel free to add them while I'm talking. I don't see the links in the chat. It's possible that they may not show up if anyone joined after.
Thank you. That's their learning curve of my whole Zoom world. So
I'm not sure about that either, but that seems to be
let me go. I'll go and re-pop them in, and hopefully everyone will see them. Thank you.
Okay, well, hi, I'm so happy to be joining tonight. As Lori said, my name is Camille Labchuk. I'm the executive director of Animal Justice, and I'm also a lawyer, and we are an animal law organization. So we focus on using the law creatively to try to help animals in Canada and elsewhere. Mostly Canada though, and that includes things like pushing for stronger laws to improve the lives of animals, trying to make sure the laws that are on the books are actually enforced, particularly against the corporate and industrial interests that abuse animals for profit, and also ensuring that animals have a voice in courtrooms across the country. When there's a way for us to get that voice into the court, we will. My own personal story doesn't have anything to do with laboratory animals much, although I grew up on the East Coast in Prince Edward Island, and some of my earliest memories of caring about animals, I always had cats, we had hamsters, and lots of animals growing up, but the first time I recall seeing or learning anything about people being cruel to animals was when I saw images of the commercial seal slaughter on television when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old. And I just remember being really shocked by what I saw, and that people would club baby seals to death for their fur. So, later when I was 12, I saw a documentary on CBC. I think it was about bears in China. It didn't have anything to do with the meat industry, but it inspired me to move away from eating animals, and I went veg. And my mom did with me too, which is great when you're 12 because you can't cook your own food. I went to university, and I had no idea that a career in animal rights was a potential option. So I studied psychology. And after university, I found myself living and working in Ottawa for the head of the Federal Green Party, then Elizabeth May. And I became really inspired by how she, as a former lawyer and someone who had a law degree, used that training to really affect change. So, we'd been doing work in Parliament. This was before she was actually elected as an MP, but we'd still get invited to things like a so-called budget lockup. So that's when the government's introducing a budget at 4 p.m. and they'll let opposition parties and the media into this room in advance so they can read through the budget and be prepared to comment on it when the 4 p.m. Release time happens. And so, we go in this room, they take away our Blackberries, they take away our laptops, no electronic communications, so you can't leak the news of what's in the budget. So she'd be reading this, massive document and understanding everything really quickly because of her experience and training as a lawyer. And I saw how useful that was as someone who was trying to make social change. And around the same time, I'd started thinking more about trying to be engaged in animals more professionally. And I learned about the field of animal law, so that was pretty exciting. And I also kind of came full circle on the issue of the seal hunt because I was invited to go to the seal hunt with Humane Society International Canada. They base their operations in PEI when they watch the hunt. They fly out there with helicopters. They try to film images of the commercial seal slaughter. And PEI, where I grew up, was a natural place for their headquarters during that period. And because I had familiarity with the province and knew the lay of the land, it was helpful.
Want to have some food? I got some mush.
So I ended up joining HSI for the seal hunt campaign. And that was the first time I realized that, oh my God, there's all these people around the world who actually have jobs full-time working on behalf of animals. So I decided at that point to try to move in that direction and try to go to law school and see if I could practice animal law. I did not know if that would work out because there were no animal law groups at the time. There was one Canadian animal lawyer who taught a course at University of Toronto, so that's where I went. And luckily, it really has worked out. I think the growth of the field of animal rights and protection in Canada over the last decade and 2 decades for sure has been really inspiring. We've seen some massive change and really these ideas becoming mainstream and people having public discussions about how we should treat animals, which is really exciting to me. So that's kind of briefly my story, and I'd be happy to chat about anything else that anyone might want to bring up.
Camille, sorry. So just as first off, I apologize because I totally under introduced you. So I'll just say that's just my bad.
Fine. I think I covered it, so we're good.
You did, which is awesome. I'm like, oh, that wasn't great. But I just live and learn on these Zooms. So there you go. Okay, so tell us now, just in the word, what are you working on right now? And what's your biggest obstacle with the government when working, like when you're working on laws, etc.?
Yeah, sure. Well, given the topic and what I think a lot of people here are interested in and what you work on, Laurie, I'll mention one thing that I've worked on a lot over the last couple of years with Andrew as well, which is an analysis of the regime governing animal testing in Canada. We've been working together with a lot of other really smart folks as well on a white paper. So white paper is sort of an academically oriented paper that explains policy in some detail, designed usually for policymakers. And this white paper focuses on the oversight of animal testing in Canada, or lack thereof. So some of you probably already know quite a lot about this, so I won't go into too much detail on it unless anyone wants to ask follow-up questions. But essentially, we let a private nonprofit, I don't want to use the word police because that's too generous to them, but vaguely oversee animal testing in Canada. This body, which Andrew knows quite well, the Canadian Council on Animal Care, creates guidelines for how animals in labs should be treated. And it sort of enforces those guidelines, but it's not a law enforcement agency. It doesn't have legal authority. It can't lay charges against anybody for violating the guidelines. All it can do is say that an institution that happens to be participating in its processes is not complying and shouldn't get further government funding. So it's a really, really soft enforcement mechanism. It doesn't really count. And there's lots of very specific criticisms about the system as well, which is the fact that inspections take place roughly every 3 to 5 years, depending on the circumstances. There's no publicly available information about what those inspectors find when they do their inspections. It's all kept private and highly confidential. So I would say, with respect to trying to drive this issue forward, I think what a lot of us have come to appreciate is that we really need a legal oversight regime, as most of the countries do. So you could look at the United States for sure, and I'm sure Mary would have lots of comments about how that system does not work well either, which I agree with entirely. And I wouldn't say that a lot of places have done an excellent job with this, but I think a legal oversight regime run by the government would be better than what we have right now at the federal level in Canada. So a lot of us are interested in pushing the feds to adopt something like that. And I would say that there are two sort of main barriers to this, issue. And you can extrapolate from this issue to all kinds of other animal protection issues, whether it be animals used in food, in zoos and entertainment, aquariums, even in the pet trade or for pet breeding. But one of the issues is the invisibility of animals used in laboratories. So because we don't have any legal oversight, in the United States, one mechanism that does exist that is somewhat helpful, and advocates have used this to their advantage frequently, is inspection reports. So if the USDA goes into a lab, there could be an inspection report available. So a person could access that and publicize it, and get some news stories and shine some light on the conditions that animals perhaps are experiencing. If there was a situation where a lot of animals died in the laboratory, which does happen all the time, a lot of the time, because of USDA inspections, there's some public information that seeps out about what happened. In Canada, never really happens. The only situations where we do get to peel back the curtain a little bit and see what's behind the closed doors is if a whistleblower comes forward and shares some information. So, a couple of years ago, I think this was 2018 at the University of Calgary, a researcher there was exposed to the CBC by a whistleblower. This was a professor there who I believe had been conducting some operations on rats and mice. I forget if it was both. Perhaps you remember, Andrew, but it was certainly rodents. And the anesthesia that they had administered to the rodents wore off, and so they were cutting into live conscious animals who experienced quite a lot of pain. And instead of doing anything about that, they just held them down to keep them still. It was really appalling. And the only reason that came out is because a whistleblower approached the CBC. There's no person or body or agency that would have any ability to go in there and determine this on their own. So, this is not a unique problem to Canada. The lack of information and transparency exists all over, but I think we have it especially bad given that we don't have any inspection reports. There's also never really been, much in the way of laboratory investigations in Canada. There was one into ITR laboratories in Montreal that aired on W5 in 2017, which I'm sure lots of you know about, but not systematically in the same way that a lot of activists in the United States and the UK, especially I'm thinking of, really focused on laboratory investigations and exposing images and doing rescues. So there's a real barrier with the public understanding that this issue exists and that it's a problem that we should all care about and that animals are really, really suffering behind closed doors. So that's issue number one. And then issue number two is the fact that industries who use animals and profit from using them, and even in the industries who don't profit necessarily, but their universities, their research institutions, they have a lot of sway with the government. So they're able to say, look, this is an industry, this is important, we are protecting people's health. We are driving medical achievements and advancing science in the public interest. We're making sure people are safe from products that could be toxic, or making sure the environment or other animals are safe from these products. And those are messages that are challenging to combat, especially without emotionally compelling stories about what animals endure in labs. So the government places outsized weight on those industry interests and the institutions that use animals, and it can be very difficult for an animal advocacy movement without being able to show the public what happens to counter that and build any kind of public support for changing our laws.
Wow. Okay, so anybody raise their hand? I'm just going to talk because I have a billion things going through my head, but if anyone raises their hand, I'm going to defer to you guys. So, yeah, okay, let's speak. So in terms of the CCAC and maybe I'm sure, Andrew, you'll have input in this. What do you got? Because we know that this body, first off, we know that private labs are not subject to the CCAC guidelines. They're not funded. They don't have to say anything. We also know, I think, Andrew, you had mentioned that and I think they actually say this in their documentation, that the CCAC gives ample opportunity for the facility to prepare for their coming. So, they're well prepared for them to show up and do their so-called investigation, right? But what do you guys realistically think about the recent public feedback call on their draft? Do you think that it could make a difference if we all chimed in? What are your thoughts, both of you, actually? Camille, what are your thoughts first on where you think that's going?
Yeah, great question. And I'm sure Andrew will have a lot more to say about this than I will, so I'll try to keep it brief. But one thing I do know about the CCAC, and this is from a friend who used to work there as a laboratory inspector, they're terrified of the public. They're terrified of public engagement. They don't really want people to know who they are or promote themselves in any particular way. I think that may be changing, but that's historically been their bent.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that they're vulnerable to public pressure. I think that they're worried about what the activists are going to do. They don't really understand that world, and they're concerned about how their image could suffer if they're the target of a campaign. So I do think that there is a real opportunity to start offering feedback. I think we've seen that with other self-regulatory agencies. I would call the CCAC a self-regulatory agency. Essentially the lab people all running it, except for a few good folks like Andrew and some others that we know. But where there have been public consultation processes and comment periods like this one, say for farmed animal codes of practice, a very similar process, that public consultation has mattered. It has made a difference. And I think it's pushed those bodies toward understanding what public opinion is, and being concerned that if they're not responsive to it, they could lose legitimacy. So I wouldn't say, that we're going to get everything we want, but I do think it's important to participate in those processes.
Awesome. Thank you. Andrew?
I don't have much more to add because I thought that was all well said. I mean, in full disclosure to folks, I'm on the committee that actually helped create this document. So I can't say I can't say anything about content in meetings because I'm under a gag rule for that. Just I can re-emphasize what Camille has said very, very, very well, that it's feedback matters. And the mandate for the CCAC is to respond to Canadians and to reflect their values. Now, I think I can step away from any of the experience I've had in the CCAC to agree with Camille in that the CCAC hasn't got a great track record of holding itself accountable in any substantive way to Canadians. And so I think this is one of the few avenues that is offered to Canadians in general. And of course, for those of you in the US, please send in comments too, because they're going to be most welcome. But this is one of the only avenues available to hold them accountable. They're not accountable to any department or ministry or agency. This is it. And, they will, I mean, all of your comments will be looked at. They'll be collated, of course, because the committee can only, that's done behind the scenes before the committee will get to the comments, but they will be looked at. I would emphasize that make sure that both the positive and the negative have equal play in your comment length. Because as you can imagine, when people are reading comments, sometimes it's very, very easy to fall back on what jumps out as negative as opposed to what's positive. And these are compromised documents. I mean, this is I don't mean in the deep sense, though I could speak to that later when I'm no longer serving, but I don't mean that in the deep sense of being morally compromised, but it is a document of compromise. So everyone in the committee, you can see the list. If you go to the CCAC annual reports, you'll see the list of the committee including me on it, and it's got a diverse voice, and that's on purpose. But it does mean that there's no one voice speaking around the table, and so the document has to reflect that the CCC did go out of their way to actually try and make sure there was a representative set of voices around the table, and I thought they did quite a good job at that, including someone from the general public, or general publics is the way sociologists get me to try and talk about it. So I would agree with Camille. Take this seriously, send it in. If you like something, make sure you spend as much time talking about that as the negative stuff. Recognize that it's a document of compromise, and so as Camille says, it's not. These things will only go so far. They can only go so far. Really, everyone will be dissatisfied with it in one way or another, no matter what happens with the document. No one's going to be happy, and there's a heavy weight with this stuff because these documents they don't stop research, which means animals are harmed regardless of what this document looks like, and that's a heavy moment. That's I encourage input and take Camille's advice quite seriously. It's a good idea to do it.
Okay, well, that's great to know, because we certainly want to push it. We want to have it out there ourselves so that as many people know. I admittedly didn't even know we were at this point and ready for the feedback until you had sent me that it was ready, Andrew, which I appreciate. We had talked about it in the past that it was coming up, but this way there's still time because the deadline is September 9th. And so for us as an advocacy organization as well as Rescue, we can get that out there numerous times and really put it out there so that people we will definitely emphasize that it's taken it's that people's. I think that now people are a little bit jaded sometimes now with the government, where they go, my voice doesn't matter, and so they figure what's the point, and it'll be. I really would love to emphasize that this is important and that our voice is important. And we are speaking for the animals that are locked away and, as you say, invisible in the basements of laboratories where nobody really gets into in Canada. And the funny thing, not funny, but it's almost a daily conversation I have where people say, does this really happen in Canada? This doesn't happen here. This only happens in the big bad United States of America, right? Because they're horrible and we're the good ones. And, that's kind of the amusing stereotype. But that CTV News that put out about the Envigo, the 4,000 Envigo beagles, Mary and I, this has been a story in the United States for months and months now. And in Canada, CTV put it out, 2 days ago. And that's fine. It didn't happen in Canada. I understand it, but it was a very monumental thing that occurred, that this judge, had the release of these animals and shut this one particular facility down, albeit they have arms in many other places. It's still a monumental thing. And still, when I went on to the CTV Facebook with the news, people all over, there was hundreds of comments. Well, this doesn't happen here. That's in the States. Oh, of course that happened. So, I spent 2 hours in the morning going through comments saying, no, it really happens here. We're an advocacy organization. We just got to Canada because, it was just running rampant. And I think that, with the private labs being so hidden, I think it's very hidden in Canada, and the little to no regulations have not helped that. It is really invisible, Camille, as you say. The animals are invisible, the laws are invisible, they're none to a degree. And so it's not in the forefront of anyone's brain because there's not even any regulations that someone would see to say, wait a minute, that happens. It's almost like it's just this hidden thing that happens here and nobody knows.
Yeah, and Lori, it's interesting because I was involved in Mercy for Animals Canada. That was a US organization that we founded a chapter in Canada, and it does a lot of undercover investigations into factory farms. That was about 10 years ago that we started doing that. Prior to that point, it was the same thing. Canadians just refused to believe that farming practices that we all saw in those videos from the States happened in Canada as well. And in fact, the situation is probably worse here. It really does take evidence. It takes like repeated shocking images and footage in front of people's eyes for them to believe that Canadians aren't as nice and polite as we think we are, or certainly that our governments are not.
I have a quick question. I was wondering like about the whistleblower, because I don't know much about Canadian law. Like, how strong are your whistleblower laws? Is that, like, I think they're fairly strong here. So that kind of encourages people. Whereas if, you can have whistleblowers, but if you probably don't have as many if you don't have strong laws for them to feel like they're going to be protected.
Yeah, it kind of depends on the jurisdiction. Alberta, so Canada has followed in the US footsteps a little bit with respect to something called ag-gag laws, and those are often considered in the context of farming, but they're anti-whistleblower laws that started in the States and made it an offense to go undercover in an employment position or a volunteer position at a farm or slaughterhouse. And a lot of US states have now struck those down thanks to lawsuits brought by advocates. And unfortunately, even though it's waning now in your country, Mary, we're picking up steam for ag-gag here in Canada. So about 3 years ago, government started passing those laws here. We've got one in Ontario right now. There's something in PEI in Manitoba that's not as bad, but still not great. But Alberta is the real concern because in Alberta, this ag-gag law doesn't just apply to farms, it applies to any private property. So that would include labs. So if somebody went to get a job in the lab to blow the whistle if they saw animal cruelty, they could be prosecuted and fined quite a lot of money. If an organization did so, they could be fined up to $200,000 and jailed. Individuals can be jailed as well. So not a great climate in Alberta. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it's Alberta. But I would say the rest of the country, it's not the most unsafe situation for employees. It's usually easy enough to come forward and expose that information. Sometimes employers might be able to pursue somebody, but typically they won't because all that does is serve to highlight their wrongdoing. So yeah.
Okay.
Laura, I see you have your hand raised too.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
There you
yes,
go.
hi, thank you. Yeah. I just want to tell you, Lori, because you can mute I think you have the control to mute people
I do.
on Zoom, just
I
in
do.
case. Okay.
Thank you.
Just in case we hear any background
Yes.
noises. What else? Oh my gosh. Okay, so I've been writing and writing and writing. So this public feedback, and I hope, because my internet connection is not very good, so I hope I don't freeze or anything like that. But this public feedback to the CCAC, which is due on September 9th, I was wondering if I could get like, what are the actual, leave your comments. So am I writing a letter and emailing it? Am I posting something to their website? What are the logistics of this? Is there going to be a scripted petition that I could sign? Or do I have to come up with my own stuff? Or how is this feedback given? Like, I'm just kind of like, well, where do I go? Do I write a paper letter and send it through the mail? Do I go on their website? Like, what? I don't, because that's an obstacle in front of me right now.
Yeah, happy to help
So
with
that was one thing. Okay, good. And I just wanted to mention too, there's actually, because I follow the Whale Sanctuary Project, and there's an Educators for Animals conference going on today. So I was like, oh no, it kind of like it's at the same time as today. So just between the two, between today's meeting and that. And then I agree, like about the argument about what really got me on board with this animal testing, because at first I thought, and sorry, this is just point number 3 of 4. So at first I thought, who's going to listen to this? Because if anyone has a sick child, of course they're going to say, I would rather see however many animals die for a cure for this or that or whatever. So I kind of felt defeated. Like, how can you go up against that argument? But what really struck me and got me on board and be like, oh my gosh, there's a fighting chance, is the research that Dr. Our other guest this evening that's doing at the University of Windsor. And the point being, like, I don't have a science background, but that I could argue with people and say, this animal testing is being proven as not as efficient as we think. So if we can, so how, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's such a key thing to get people on board, is to be like, if you want that cure, guess what? You're wasting your time, your funding with hurting animals. So it's a win-win if we don't hurt animals and we get better scientific results, right? And then I'm just learning about, I noticed these ag-gag laws. So I guess it depends, it's provincial government that's handling this. And I guess it just depends what government is in power at the time. It kind of seems to me like if like a conservative pro-business government is in power, then they're going to put these ag-gag laws in place. And if they're just regular laws, not protected constitutionally, or I guess they can change, right? Like they can get changed depending on what government's in power, right? So those are my 4 things. Sorry, if that was it. So yeah, so the feedback, I don't know where to go with that. I don't know how to do that.
Yeah. Very happy to help, Laura. So thanks for all of your comments and your thoughtfulness. I'll address the feedback first. So, and Andrew might have stuff to add to this, but so I just got back from a trip yesterday. I haven't gone through the document in detail yet, but we're starting to do that. And sometime next week, we're aiming to get out basically a guide to public comment. So we're reviewing what's there, identifying some gaps and areas where we think that people should provide feedback on. And if you're already on the Animal Justice email list, you'll get a notification about that. We'll do a blog about it as well if you just check out our website, but you can join the list, animaljustice.ca, and then you'll get notice. And we aim to make it very easy for people to fill out these forms. So there's essentially the official route to commenting, which is through a survey that CCAC offers. So what we hope to have is just an explanation of what's in the survey, an explanation of how people can respond to it effectively. And one of the keys is trying to put things into your own words. And it sounds like you're great at doing that. You mentioned you've been writing, so that's really helpful. Because what we don't want to see is a bunch of duplication responses and copy and pasted responses. Right. Those have much less resonance with people reviewing them. They just think, oh, it's some advocacy group campaign. And it becomes a lot easier to dismiss. So writing your own comments in your own words, you can use, our text as inspiration, but try to change it up a bit. And then you mentioned, in addition to a survey, whether you should be writing something else. I do think that getting multiple forms of communication on this also has a lot of power. So I don't think it's a bad idea to send letter mail about these types of issues. I know when politicians get letter mail, they really notice that because it's so unusual these days. I don't think it's a bad idea to make a phone call to the CCAC. It may be outside of their officially recognized channels, but when individuals, whether they're politicians, NGOs, or bodies like the CCAC, when they start getting an unusual volume of contact on an issue, they know they have to start paying attention to it. So I encourage you to try a bunch of different routes, and maybe writing an overall sort of letter, a paper letter, or even just an email to them would also be a really good idea. Yeah, so that's great. Yeah, the Educators for Animals Conference, that's awesome. Love those folks. I'm not at it, unfortunately, but I'm sure we'll get a recap at some point. And then the other thing I can speak to is ag gag laws. Yeah, so animal justice is actually challenging Ontario's ag gag law in court. That process is ongoing right now. We had a hearing date for October. I think it's going to have to be moved to the spring, unfortunately, because it keeps getting delayed because everything that takes longer than it should when you're fighting a lawsuit. But yeah, you asked what motivated governments to pass ag gag laws, and I think it is largely conservative politicians who are receptive to the message. Every province that's passed ag gag so far has been conservative. Where we've seen ag gag attempts fail are at the federal level, which is dominated not by conservatives. And in BC, there was an attempt in 2019. It didn't really go anywhere. And BC doesn't have a conservative government. So the provinces that are currently run by conservatives are vulnerable, just not great. You mentioned, yeah, the ability of governments to change the laws quite easily. Yes, they can do that. The thing is that they do still have to respect the Constitution. And the basis for our lawsuit against Ontario for its ag gag laws, and we eventually plan to file a similar one in Alberta, is that the law in Ontario says you can't enter a facility using false pretenses. So you can't deceive the owner of a barn or a slaughterhouse about why you want to go in. And that's bullshit, because you can simply get a job there and work there if you would like to, and conceal your true intentions and film wrongdoing if you see it. I believe that's a constitutionally protected activity. So the point is that you still have to comply rather with the Canadian Constitution, which says that people have expression rights. We have the right to express ourselves, and that freedom of expression is protected. And that right protects not just the person who's saying information, so it protects them from being forced by the government to say or not say something in most circumstances. It also protects listeners. So we're arguing both that this discriminates directly against people who might want to seek jobs in undercover in facilities to expose animal cruelty, but it also affects the broader Canadian community and people who might want to receive accurate information about farms and don't have any way to get that information unless they're relying on information from whistleblowers and from people who document those jobs undercover. So, I think it's really important that we have that right. That's how the US cases have succeeded, is relying on the First Amendment rights that are similar to Canada's right to free expression. And we're very optimistic that we'll have the same success.
Yeah, I would. Do you mind if I just add to that, Camille? You guys, I just wanted to add too about the effectiveness of because I know that Dr. Chandrasekhara has discussed the fact, and I think the statistics, and I think you brought this up as well, Andrew, when we were meeting last time, is that it is basically a 90% ineffectiveness, animal testing in general. So I think you're right, Laura, that it's important to get that legitimate statistics out there that show that the animal use model is not what people believe it to be, that we're not, necessarily sweeping the globe and curing all sorts of, diseases with animal testing. And what we found too is, and we've had this discussion, and it's kind of part of building our community, is that we found that the majority of people that go into animal care in these facilities suffer greatly from PTSD and anxiety, etc. And they really went in with for the most part. I mean, we know that there's always bad seeds, and I've mentioned this to most of you that I did work in corrections for over a decade. So I know there's bad seeds in the world, but they're really few and far between. And I think that the majority you know, we take the stand that the majority of people that get into research do it with good intentions for humanity, and then suffer greatly in their own right, you know, and to no good end. So really the elimination of animal testing, in our opinion, is only good for animals and for humanity. So if we could get that across in some mass way, then, you know, that would be the wish list, I guess. But that's something I wanted to ask you, Camille. What's your career wish list?
God, it's long. It's long. I mean, we work so much on farming that really regulating farming because of the number of animals used. I mean, it's, you know, about 825 million animals, land animals, were killed in the food system last year, and it really eclipses all the other categories of animals that are used. You know, research is less than 10 million, substantially less than 10 million. Everything else is even less than that. So, you know, I view that as a really major problem that we need to tackle. And right now there's no laws regulating the treatment of animals on farms. Nothing about how much space they get, sunlight, what conditions should be like, whether they're entitled to veterinary care. And just like we've got with animals in labs, no oversight. In fact, the situation's probably even worse because there's literally, you know, there's no body even like the CCAC that does kind of inspections. So it's very, very bad. So that's a big one for me. And just to be clear, I'm not simply calling for regulation because I think farming can be made humane. I see that as a tool toward ending much of factory farming and animal agriculture that's really damaging our planet, human health, and harming animals. So that's a big one for me. You know, oversight over animal testing, something that Andrew and I and lots of others have been working on recently, I think is really important as well. I would like to see as well public support for animal welfare infrastructure. And what I mean by that is that most animal care in this country is done by private organizations, motivated and run by volunteer power and volunteer donations. So humane societies, SPCAs, groups like, you know, all of the ones that are represented here tonight and all the ones in the animal protection field, they're all private in nature. There's not really much public support for any of this work. So governments tend to treat animals as just this private responsibility that they don't want to get involved with. So they don't want to bother overseeing farms. They don't want to bother overseeing labs, and they're not going to devote any money or much money toward caring for even cats and dogs. So I would just really like to see animal welfare being institutionalized and treated as something that the government accepts that it has a role in overseeing. You know, at the moment, we don't have anything like an animal welfare commission in Canada or commissioner or any structures within government to evaluate the impact of policies on animals. You know, for children and youth, a lot of provinces have a children and youth advocate whose job is literally to watch out for children and youth because they're vulnerable and subject to abuses, especially by the state, whether they're in care homes or other institutions. And, you know, that person's job is to advocate for them publicly and investigate the situation for them and make recommendations. I think we need something like that for animals. So there's a lot of ways we need to institutionalize the attitudes I think most of us already have, which are that animals matter. Even people who aren't passionate animal advocates, the vast majority of them don't want to see cruel practices. People who consume animal products don't want to see animals suffer on the way to their plates. You know, things like cosmetic testing and product testing, very, very low support for that. Medical testing, as we know, is a bit more complicated. Medical research is, but I think we can get there with some of the innovations and changes Lori talked about and some of the communication strategies and information. So I would just really like to see governments accept that Canadians have reached that point and start to introduce those policies. And to be a little bit more optimistic, I think we're starting to get there. The conversation is changing. The feds actually outlawed whale and dolphin captivity 3 years ago, which is a campaign I had the honor of being part of, and it was a pretty cool moment. First time in over 100 years that there've been any significant change to animal cruelty laws in this country. And we're starting to see other action too, and starting to see that the conversation pick up on these issues. We've got the Jane Goodall Act now in Parliament. We've got Bill S5, which would take potentially a huge chunk out of the animal testing requirements that the government currently imposes and potentially make that a thing of the past. So there is progress. It's not fast enough, but I don't want to leave anybody, with the sense that I'm feeling pessimistic. I'm not. I'm feeling like there's a good future for this.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I think that the days of thinking everyone's just a crazy vegan activist is gone. There's actually some things going on that people can acknowledge, right? It's not that same, stigma that you get that, we've seen for a long time or saw decades ago, for sure.
Totally.
Yeah, which is exactly what it was. And as much as I'm not pro instituting, more and more government regulations, that this is sorely lacking. Absolutely. These are vulnerable creatures and you're right. It's in the private world where we're all just kind of saying, hey, over here, this is what's going on. So, and it's hard to get the attention of the world. The world is so fast paced and short attention span, and it's hard to get that going.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Does anyone have any other questions before go ahead, Shannon.
Hi, Camille. I live in Calgary, Alberta. So it's just interesting you talking about some of the Calgary things. I can see that. I guess my question to you is, I'm very new to this. I'm just starting to become aware of all the stuff going on that I didn't know was happening in even the world in Canada. So I got a Beagle puppy, and then that's when it all exploded. And I wanted to know, for someone starting out and a regular Joe person, I just feel like there's so much information. Like, are there things in Canada, especially websites to check out? Like, I just joined your animal justice, or information or policies, books to start to become versed in this. And beside the feedback to CACC, is there anything in my province I could be part of or do? I just feel overwhelmed and I don't know where to go. So, and for someone new, what would you give as a suggestion who's just trying to learn about this and to maybe make a small difference? Where would the impact be?
Oh, I love your question, Shannon. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for being open and being willing to learn about this. And I'm so glad you've been inspired to do that. Yeah. So in terms of resources, are you guys hearing me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I am.
Okay, good. I got a sign that said my internet's unstable. Yeah, so in terms of resources, yeah, our website has some information. Websites from other advocacy groups do as well. I would say there's not much information about animal research and testing in Canada in particular, if that's what you're looking for, because it's so secretive. It's a really opaque field. One thing that actually you could look at, and I'll try to find the link right now while we're chatting, and I'll put it in the chat. Is Animal Alliance of Canada put out a really awesome report on the CCAC in particular. Okay. It's longer and more comprehensive than the white paper that we're producing, but it is a really detailed look at the lay of the land. So I'd recommend looking at that if that's something you're interested in. Sure. I can't find it right now, but I'll put it in when I'm done talking. And another thing you could look at is animal justice. Until the beginning of this year, we produced a podcast every couple of weeks called Paw and Order. And we're no longer doing it actively. It just sort of ran its course, but it still exists. You can still find it on, Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else. Okay. And Paw and Order has close to 100 episodes, and most of them deal with a specific topic related to animals. Okay. So it's a really good archive. It's a wealth of information. If you're a podcast listener kind of person, it'll keep you going for a while. Some of the information is sort of timely and like newsy, but a lot of it is just like, what are the laws about dog breeding in Canada? What's this? What's that? So it still works. Okay. And in terms of ways to make a small difference, Yeah, I think there's a lot, and it kind of really depends on what you feel called to do and what your talents and interests and skills are. One thing I really push people to do is get engaged with their local politician and make
Okay.
sure that person understands that animals matter to at least one of their constituents, and that, you know, a credible, reasonable person is coming to them bringing these concerns. Because I think that's what ultimately results in a lot of politicians
Mhm.
taking these issues seriously.
Okay.
But another thing you could really look at, Shannon, actually, I should have mentioned this off top because it's a good resource too for subjects, not just for activism, is that we've produced something called the Animal Justice Academy. It's animaljusticeacademy.com. And that is a free 6-week online training course. The program ran live about a year and a half ago, and now it just is evergreen and it lives on this website. You can sign up, engage with whatever weeks and whatever modules that might interest you. But
Okay.
there's one is sort of an overview of all the issues. So what's it like on farms? Dr. Charu Chandrasekhara does a module on animals and labs. All the topics are covered.
Okay.
Week 2 is starting to get active in your communities, how you can advocate in your communities. I think week 3 is about politics and policies.
Mhm.
There's a week about resilience, how to take care of yourself as an animal activist. And I can't even
Mhm.
remember what the others are right now, but it's so much information. Video modules, they've got transcripts as well, and even audio recordings. So it's super accessible and it's all free.
Oh, thank you.
You know what? I'm gonna just say, because that's so much amazing information, Camille, if you wouldn't mind when you have time, like whenever you have a moment, emailing that to me, because what we do, Shannon, is in a few days, in this case, it might be a little bit longer because our IT person is on vacation, but we put together a recap and we send the video. We do a video so that you have the video in case you want to look at these, but we do add all of the resources that we talked about. So we'll send you
Okay.
links, etc. So if you haven't by that point found them, we'll kind of put them in a concise way in the follow-up email.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that was awesome. Awesome question and awesome resources. That's great.
Oh, and I should add too, we actually do, although the program's no longer running live, we still do live events a couple times a month. So there's usually an evening event once monthly, and then sort of a lunchtime live event on Thursdays every couple of weeks. And there's always like a guest speaker that comes to that. Laura, you should join sometime. Actually, that'd be good. And that speaker will talk about whatever they're working on, and it's a good way to meet others and get engaged a little bit and see what others are working on.
Thank
And
you.
you can sort of stay in touch if you join that program via animaljusticeacademy.com.
Awesome. That's
So
awesome.
I'll join Animal Justice and also the Beagle Alliance. I'm a member, so there you go.
Thank
It's a
you.
start.
Yay. Thank you. Yeah,
I'm
there
so-
is so much out there, and I mean, we're still learning about things too, because we're just new to working in Canada as well. So yeah, it's amazing how overwhelmed you can become with everything, really. So thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions?
I'm a really bad student. I was just looking up Bill S5. Can you repeat that lunchtime thing, Camille? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So it's animaljusticeacademy.com. If you visit that website, you can join the program and participate as little or as much as you want in that, just watch modules or whatever. But once you join that emailing list as well, then you'll start getting notices about any events we're doing that are evening or lunchtime events. They're all on Zoom.
Gotcha. Okay. Lori, can I go ahead?
Go ahead, please. Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely, Laura.
Yeah. So okay. So let me get this right. So the CCAC invitation for public feedback is one thing that we can actively do. And then the other thing that we can do is contact our local federal members of parliament to get them to support the Bill S5 amendment. That's the other thing that we can do is and then I'm looking at this and it's like really confusing what Bill S5 is. I understand basically it takes a big chunk out of it. It'll say that testing for certain things is no longer required. Am I understanding that right? And then we could contact our local MPs to help get that through. That's oh no, did everybody hear me? Or was I? Uh-oh.
There was a little cutout there. Did everyone experience that?
Yeah,
Yes, I experienced that. I thought maybe nobody heard me.
Laura, what was your last question about I think it was about the guy calling the MP is what I thought your last little bit was about.
Yeah, so Bill S5, my layman's regular Joe understanding is that it would eliminate the need to do eliminate the must of having to do a bunch of testing. So it would take a big chunk of testing, saying that it's no longer necessary to do. And so a good move on our part would be like an actual action would be to contact our local MPs to support, or is it in the Senate right now? Like what stage is it at? Can we do anything about that right now as constituents?
Yeah, so the bill is, it finished the Senate process, which is great. Laura, I just put a link in the chat with a blog post that has more information about it. So I would say the two main things that the bill does that are most exciting to me is that it requires the government to publish a plan within the next 2 years about how it will promote the creation and use of animal-free testing methods. And it imposes a duty on the government to encourage and incorporate these alternative methods to animal testing. So that's really important. And it also prevents governments from using animal testing to make decisions about whether a substance is toxic, unless there's absolutely no other way to do it except for testing on an animal. So it's got some really strong provisions, and that blog post has more information. Right now, I think the best thing you can do right now is just send a personal note to your member of parliament and let them know that you support this legislation. You want it to pass through with these strong amendments to help animals. The bill, when it was originally introduced, it had a preamble. So there's some good text in there about how the government wanted to reduce animal testing, but there was nothing in the actual bill that would have accomplished that. So we worked really hard, and other groups did too, to make those amendments happen at committee. And we found some supportive senators who really helped with that. So the bill was amended to assist with that goal in mind. And it's not perfect right now, but it's pretty good. It's very progressive, certainly compared to what we have now. So we don't want to see those amendments slashed when it gets to the House of Commons. So you can maybe point out to your member of parliament that that's important to you. And I would always copy the health minister and the environment minister and the prime minister's office on this email, because those are the ministries that have some responsibility for this as well. And just a final note, the bill will eventually start going for hearings in the House of Commons, and there will be some votes at that point. We will have an action page up for everyone so that you can easily take action to email all those people with all those points. It just won't be for a little bit yet until the time is right.
Camille, pardon me, health minister, and what was the other minister that you had mentioned?
So it's health, it's environment, and we always copy the prime minister's office too, because they're responsive to some extent to public pressure.
Right, okay. That's great. Okay, well, Camille, who was the cat?
Oh, that was Cecily. She's getting really mad that I haven't fed her 9:30 dinner yet. Not rescued from the lab, but rescued from the streets, I believe. Very cute, very noisy, very, very noisy.
Well, mine behind me was not rescued from the lab either, but he's my boy who, because we wanted to know what inspired you. So I will just share this because he's right behind me, but he did pass in March, and he was my boy of 14 years. And I didn't know anything about beagles. So as Shannon, you were saying, you know, when I first rescued him, he was a year and I was a shepherd girl and I had no idea what to do with a little beagle. I didn't know anything about scent hounds or the fact that he would spend the majority of his life attempting to get out of my yard or any of those things. And I do attribute my beautiful courtyard to my dog because I had to fence him in. So, but he, when I Googled him, that's Googled beagles and what do I do? How do I train a beagle? Apparently you don't, but nonetheless, how do you train a beagle? And that's how I found out. And I was a cosmetic formulator and I knew what good ingredients meant and how they didn't, you know, there's safe ingredients that don't need to be tested on animals, of course. And so, yeah, that was kind of my introduction when I just looked in his face and thought, who could hurt this creature, right? And I'm sure we all think that way when we see the photos. And of course, Mary could share in many stories because she has more laboratory rescues, her and her sister Liza, than any humans that I know. So they're like,
Yeah.
so
We didn't, you know, oh, I'm getting reverberation. Do you hear that?
no, we hear you perfectly, I think.
Okay, good. Yeah. I mean, I didn't set out to do that, but it just kind of happened over time. So I do have 3 actual laboratory beagles. 2 of them were 10 years in a laboratory being tested on, and they were made blind in the laboratory. And so they came out when they were just a little over 10 years old, and I've now had them going on 5 years. So. But 2 little females and they're best buddies. And then I have another one that came out of a lab here in California. And they were called seizure beagles. And she actually came out on the day of the release. She had horrible seizures and went to the emergency room and spent her first night of freedom and very many days after that trying to save her life and just get her stable enough. And she had a insulinoma, so an insulin producing tumor on her pancreas, which they don't tend to operate on because the prognosis isn't great even with that. But this was in 2020, wasn't it, Lori? Yeah, September 2020.
Yep.
And she stabilized, and we thought we were just kind of gonna, like, you know, let her go in the few weeks that she'd have, let her enjoy her little bit of freedom until then. But it came to a point that she started having seizures again. First it was, you know, kind of managed, and then she started having seizures again anyway, and the vet said, you either have to make your choice. Let's do the surgery and try to give her some time, or you have to put her, you know, you have to euthanize her right now. And we chose the surgery, and she became a diabetic for a certain period of time because, like, the minute they removed that tumor, her blood sugar shot up. And so she was on insulin for a while, and then she slowly, her pancreas, you know, kind of figured stuff out, and she came off of that, and it has recurred now, and she's on chemotherapy, but she's actually doing really, really well, and we're coming up on the 2-year mark of her surgery. So
yeah.
Oh.
And I do want to add that first night, we all spent the night. I was in California at that time at that rescue, and we all spent the night Googling this insulinoma. Like, we just went ballistic trying to find out any way in which we could help. And her prognosis, Mary, I think you'll recall, was 6 months was her prognosis. And I remember leaving California and really thinking I'd never see her again. And the next year I went to another rescue and Mary brought her, and we were just so emotional because it was a year later and we never thought it would happen. And now it's a year later and she's still doing awesome. And I think personally, I in the holistic world that I come from, I know that the surgery is great. I know that Mary has a fantastic vet, but I also know Mary and her sister, and I'm a big believer that when love and patience is there, and that she's doing well because of that world. So yeah, I just, we were told the laboratories wouldn't release animals in the beginning because they said they weren't fit for domestic life. And Mary and I have been blessed to see hundreds of animals who have defied that statement and are just amazing, loving animals in loving homes. So we hope to do that in Canada. That's the plan. That's the wish list. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, does anyone else have any animal story inspiration or any questions for Camille or Andrew or Mary and her myriad of beagles? If not, I will thank you all so very much, and thank you, Camille, again for your time and for all the resources. And we will do a recap and send resources to you guys. I will say, I know it's one of our last summer evenings, so I appreciate you guys sitting on Zoom for it. Not you, Mary, because it's just another summer evening for you in California. But
it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, Lori, and for
absolutely
you and Mary and everyone else you're doing. And it was so nice to chat with all of you. And I'm really inspired and grateful to see all the work you're doing.
Well, inspired by all the years of work, and I look forward to meeting you in a month in person and hugging you. And and thank you for all the resources. Amazing. It's unbelievable how much you guys have done and are doing. So thank you for all your work in this country and for the animals. And Andrew, thank you as usual for your amazing input. And I really urge everyone to check out Andrew's links on his website too, because Shannon, especially for what you're looking for, you're going to find a lot of resources there as well. So yeah, that's great. So anyway, thank you all. I hope you'll all join us in September when summer's over, and for our next town hall. And again, feel free to email or call us at any time. So we appreciate your support. Thank you.